Your marriage is still ultimately the priority and still ultimately the ministry that God has already called your husband into. So it's okay to keep your marriage the number one thing. Imagine this. You're years into your marriage, you've got your life established, your families, your careers, your routines, and then your spouse says, I feel called to something new. Maybe it's a new ministry, maybe it's a new career, maybe it's a big move. What are you supposed to do with that? Something that can be really challenging for a marriage is when one spouse feels called into something new that maybe the other spouse doesn't share a passion for, especially if this calling arises after you've been married for a little bit and your lives are kind of already in progress. I think this can come from either side, husband or wife, but I know that for me, I wasn't sure that my husband was called into pastoral ministry when we first got married. So as we kind of discerned our callings together, it became clear that I was going to be a pastor's wife, and I had not emotionally or mentally prepared for that the way that maybe he had. Or the way that maybe the Lord had been preparing him throughout that whole span of time. Like, I had to kind of catch up quickly. So I've thought about this a lot, and there are just a few things that I feel like the Lord has taught me and is teaching me that I think might be helpful if you're going through something similar. So first of all, I would just encourage you to remember, you don't have to just figure out how to fit into his calling. God put you two together for a reason. And what that means is that ultimately your calling probably does meaningfully intertwine with his. You just have to figure out what that looks like together. Might take a little bit of time. In Genesis 2:24, when it says that a husband and wife are supposed to be one flesh, that means that we operate together. We do things together. God wants us to be called and purposeful together. But especially if you're earlier in your marriage when some of this stuff comes up, it just might mean some learning and some hashing it out and some really meaningful conversations with one another. And with that, I think honest communication is really important. If you're not totally convinced or you're not totally on board, you should be able to ask the tough questions, to really probe into what's on his heart. Why does he feel led to X, Y, or Z? And actually, as his wife, I think there's a really cool opportunity as his number one confidant, his number one supporter, to ask questions that no one else can ask. In the partnership of marriage, I think it's your job actually to help him discern and clarify that calling as you go. And a lot of messages that I think men in particular internalize about calling actually come from culture, even Christian culture, which means that sometimes that pushback is really, really necessary and really helpful to make sure that this calling is coming from the Holy Spirit and not from some weird other cultural message that he's maybe internalized. Ask your husband why he is passionate about this new calling, about this new thing. That helps you find practical ways to support him as he figures out what this is going to look like. Test runs are really good and really important. Just because he feels called into missions doesn't necessarily mean you have to move across the world tomorrow. Take the time you need to figure out what really is behind this calling, what really is behind these new passions, and let him try those out in the community you're already in, so you can better discern what it needs to look like as you move forward with this calling, assuming that it is from God. And remember, you as the wife still matter. Your marriage is still ultimately the priority and still ultimately the ministry that God has already called your husband into. So it's okay to keep your marriage the number one thing. Because again, God put you two together for a reason. My husband always says, if I fail at home, then I failed at everything. And I think that's really applicable and true. You need to make sure that your marriage is strong so that he can proceed in succeeding at his calling. And if the marriage becomes the second thing, none of it's going to work anyway. Philippians 2:4 is a really good text to keep front of mind because it says, let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. If both people in a marriage are thinking this way about a calling, I think that's a really, really helpful way to approach some of these conversations that can feel kind of tense and new and uncomfortable. There are times in any marriage where we might need to remind each other, hey, you vowed to keep this as your number one priority. And it's okay for him to say that to you, but it's also okay, especially in some of these conversations about the future and about change, to say, hey, you vowed to make this marriage your number one priority, and I want to make sure that we are doing that so that we can stay strong together. And look, if you're already in it and you feel like your husband is maybe not prioritizing your marriage as he's navigating some of this new stuff in his life, the key is always going to be open and healthy communication about what his goals are and what the parameters and boundaries need to look like in your marriage moving forward. Obviously, this is going to vary calling to calling, situation to situation, but you as the wife, I think, can feel completely biblically empowered to say, I just want to know, what does this need to look like for us to stay healthy in our marriage and for you to feel like you are following God's leading in your life? So maybe that means I need you to be home by dinner every single night, and I need to know that there's consistency in our routine. Maybe that means every single Saturday has to be family day, and that is non-negotiable. Maybe that means we need 6 months to discern together what next steps are going to look like. Being really specific, but also gracious, and the way that you present this information to your husband will make such a difference in the way these conversations go. Basically, you want to make sure you're having an intentional and specific conversation about this new chapter in your family's life that might be opening. I think it can be super fluid and casual, but you want it to stay open, because if you start harboring resentment, everything's going to fall apart really quickly. I found that once I start feeling bitter, that bitterness just kind of continues to grow until I sort of just put everything out on the table. So while I think it's really important to try to stay gentle and tender in your delivery, being more open with your communication than not is always going to be the solution. And finally, I think the most practical tip I have, as someone who has at different points felt like, okay, I can see that my husband feels called here, but maybe I'm not totally there yet, is to pray for your husband's calling. Pray for your passion to line up with his passion. Pray that the Lord would reveal to you how you can fit into this in a way that feels meaningful and exciting for you too. I really do believe that when God puts two people together, his purposes for them are intertwined. So that means that God has something for you here too. It's okay if it's messy while you figure it out, but don't give up on it. And just as a side note, if you know another couple that might be navigating a similar situation with new callings and the conflict that sometimes comes with that, I would highly encourage you to check out our 10-day couples prayer challenge. This is an opportunity for you and your spouse to lift up another couple for 10 days. And it's really cool in the way that it brings you closer together, but also offers you that opportunity to care for someone else in this behind-the-scenes way. So we'll go ahead and link that below. So if you're in this season of navigating new callings in your marriage and trying to figure out how to make that work, here are some things you're really going to want to avoid doing. First of all, comparing your callings. Again, we would affirm this idea that if you are married to another person, then God has already designed your callings to complement each other. They're not in competition. Problems start to arise when we start to prioritize one person's callings or gifts above the other. Now, that doesn't mean that there might not be seasons where either one of you is really in the thick of it and having to maybe sort of arrange your family life around one person's calling and mission a little bit more than the other for a season. But overall, the heart both of you should have in this conversation is that God has given you both a calling, and both of those things really, really matter to both of you. As a wife, championing your husband's calling really doesn't have any downsides, assuming that you've set the right boundaries in place. And if you have to pivot together, if you have to tackle any hiccups that come up down the line, you'll be in a place in your relationship where you're able to do that instead of, again, harboring that bitterness and resentment that can be so toxic to your marriage. The second thing you're going to want to avoid as much as you can is belittling or diminishing your husband's calling. Discerning calling is hard as like a single person. When you're married and you already have a life established, it's that much harder to figure out where God might be leading and what changes God might be calling you to make. As a wife, I've realized that my husband needs grace for this from me. My husband needs me to be with him as he's figuring out these difficult things and answering these big questions in his own life. Especially for those of us who got married younger, the chances are really good that at some point, one or both of you will have to answer these questions. And again, we want to make sure we're able to stay united and to stay soft toward one another. And as a note, indifference can be just as problematic and hurtful. When I get frustrated and disengage and act like I just don't care, that has been really, really hurtful to my husband and to our marriage and to our ability to have good conversations about his calling and how he's feeling about vocation overall. While it's not always going to come easily, our goal should always be unity. All in, all together. And last, just to really hammer this home, it is so important to keep a close watch on any bitterness or resentment that's developing in you. I'm married to a pastor, which means a lot of extra commitments. It means a lot of late nights. It means a lot of early mornings. It means doing things by myself with my 2 toddlers that maybe I would prefer my husband was there for. And there are some days where honestly, that is not my favorite. There have definitely been days when I've just kind of wished he could have a normal job in like sales or business or what have you. But then there are other days when I realize it's actually such a gift to be married to a man who is so driven by a sense of purpose and calling, who wants to do really meaningful and powerful things for the Lord in the world. And there's also something really special with the fact that when he has those wins in ministry, I get to be there for them. I get to share in those wins with him. So for me, trying to reframe how I understand his calling has been really important. And I think the Lord has done a lot of work in my heart of kind of getting me to that place where I see his calling as a gift rather than a burden. That doesn't mean every day is easy. That doesn't mean I'm emotionally on board with my husband's calling to ministry every single day. But it does mean that when those hard days come up, I feel better equipped to tackle that with my husband instead of against my husband. And on those days, Galatians 6:2 has been a really helpful go-to passage, which says, carry each other's burdens, and this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If you're navigating this, I feel for you. It is not easy. There's a lot of spiritual heavy lifting that God is doing in your heart and in your family right now. But just remember, your callings are compatible. God put you two together for a reason, and you fit into this equation really, really beautifully. And it's okay if it takes a little time to figure out what that is going to look like. Keep watch on bitterness and resentment in your heart, and keep communication open. That is so essential. If this was helpful for you, or if someone came to mind that you think might benefit from some of these tips, we would love for you to like, subscribe, share this video with them. And if you have anything you want to share with us, please comment below. We'd love to hear from you.